Well, Donald Trump has many bad days ahead of him as criminal defendant Trump. None will be more painful than the days he spends in Winston Chutkan's daughter's courtroom. Winston Chutkan told the New York Times that when he won a scholarship to go to high school in Jamaica, quote, "I wore shoes and experienced indoor plumbing for the first time in my life." Winston Chutkan worked very hard, did very well in high school. He went on to become an orthopedic surgeon, one of Jamaica's most prominent physicians. When his daughter, Tanya, arrived in Washington from Jamaica at age 17 to attend George Washington University, she fell in love with the city and has lived there ever since, except for her 3 years as a distinguished student at the University of Pennsylvania Law School, where she was an editor of the Law Review. Tanya's younger sister and brother both followed in their father's footsteps and became physicians. Tanya Chutkan served as a public defender in Washington, D.C., where she married another public defender and had 2 children. She then became a highly compensated member of a large Washington law firm. President Obama appointed Tanya Chutkan to a federal judgeship in 2014. Her appointment was confirmed by the United States Senate 95-0. She told her sister then, "I've never been so excited to receive a pay cut." Tanya Chutkan knows that Donald Trump thinks her blood is poison and that her children's blood is poison. Donald Trump says that immigrants like Tanya Chutkan are poisoning the blood of America, a phrase Donald Trump has lifted directly from Adolf Hitler. But the proof that Judge Chutkan bears no judicial prejudice against Donald Trump whatsoever came today in the form of a Court of Appeals opinion and order that affirmed every single word Judge Tanya Chutkan wrote in her 48-page opinion in December denying Donald Trump's claim of immunity for any crimes he committed while president. Judge Chutkan's opinion said that the presidency, quote, "does not confer a lifelong get-out-of-jail-free pass." There were many winners today when the Court of Appeals opinion was issued. Special Prosecutor Jack Smith and his brilliant legal team, the framers of the Constitution, with Alexander Hamilton being specifically quoted in the opinion supporting criminal prosecutions of former presidents. The American people who believe in the rule of law were very big winners today, and the people who believe in Donald Trump were once again, like Donald Trump himself, big losers today. But the individual biggest winner of the day was Judge Tanya Chutkan, whose work was studied line by line, word by word, by Donald Trump's lawyers who tried to rip it apart in arguments to a 3-judge panel of the Court of Appeals. And each of those judges, including a conservative Republican appointed judge who has hired law clerks who are members of the Federalist Society, unanimously agreed that Judge Chutkan was right in every word she wrote, every word. And so the day is going to come when Donald Trump stands trial in Judge Chutkan's courtroom, where every day he will be looking up at a judge who he has publicly, personally insulted by calling her a racist and hurling other insults at her. And he will be looking up at a judge who he has accused, along with every other immigrant who Donald Trump didn't marry, of poisoning the blood of America. And every day Donald Trump sits in that courtroom looking up at Judge Chutkan, he will be looking at her with raging hatred that he will not be allowed to express in that courtroom, and he will be looking at her in abject fear, which he will admit to no one. The appeals court announced at the beginning of their opinion that they were siding with Judge Chutkan's denial of Donald Trump's immunity, claim of immunity. The appeals court wrote, "Today we affirm the denial. For the purpose of this criminal case, former President Trump has become Citizen Trump." The Court of Appeals knocked down every Trump argument on immunity, saying we cannot accept former President Trump's claim that a president has unbounded authority to commit crimes that would neutralize the most fundamental check on executive power, the recognition and implementation of election results, nor can we sanction his apparent contention that the executive has carte blanche to violate the rights of individual citizens to vote and to have their votes count. The unanimous appeals court decision used the Trump lawyers' arguments about the impeachment clause against them, saying the strongest evidence against former President Trump's claim of immunity is found in the impeachment clause because it specifies that presidents, quote, shall nevertheless be liable and subject to indictment, trial, judgment, and punishment according to law. The Court of Appeals swept away the Trump claim that criminal prosecution now would amount to double jeopardy after he was tried in a Senate impeachment trial on a similar charge. The court said an impeachment does not result in criminal punishments, and the indictment does not charge the same offense as the single count in the impeachment resolution. The court crushed the Trump argument that a former president can only be prosecuted after being found guilty of the same charge in a Senate impeachment trial. The court quoted an early member of Congress in 1798 saying, whether a person tried under an impeachment be found guilty or acquitted, he is still liable to a prosecution at common law. The court said it would be a striking paradox if the president, who alone is vested with the constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, were the sole officer capable of defying those laws with impunity. 4 weeks ago, Donald Trump sat in the Court of Appeals hearing room looking up at the 3 women judges who heard this case: Judge Karen Henderson, Judge Florence Pan, and Judge Michelle Childs. There was no legal reason for him to be in the room. Donald Trump is, of course, profoundly stupid, but still not stupid enough to think that his eyes or his hair or his makeup or his red necktie would intimidate those judges. And surely the dark, twisted coils of Donald Trump's brain were still able to process the obvious fact that these 3 women had complete control over him in this proceeding. They ended their unanimous opinion on page 57 today with a fully researched and authoritative pronouncement that unsurprisingly reflects everything we heard them say in the courtroom that day, looking down at Donald Trump. Quote, we have balanced former President Trump's asserted interests in executive immunity against the vital public interests that favor allowing this prosecution to proceed. We conclude that concerns of public policy, especially as illuminated by our history and the structure of our government, compel the rejection of this claim of immunity in this case. We also have considered his contention that he is entitled to categorical immunity from criminal liability for any assertedly official action that he took as president, a contention that is unsupported by precedent, history, or the text and structure of the Constitution. Finally, we are unpersuaded by his argument that this prosecution is barred by double jeopardy principles. Accordingly, the order of the district court is affirmed. So ordered.